Hey all, in this video we're going to be looking at oligopolies, and this is going to be our last video for Unit 4. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the characteristics of oligopolies and the three different types of oligopolies that there are. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so oligopolies. So in the last video we looked at game theory, which is pretty much the more important part of it, but we still need to go over what the graph looks like and the characteristics of this particular market structure. So the characteristics of oligopolies is that there are few large producers. If you want a number, less than 10, right? So in and of itself, an oligopoly acts like a monopoly, right? A monopoly is just one big firm controlling a vast amount of the industry. Well, an oligopoly is the same thing, but if you replace the one large firm with the few large firms, right, then you get essentially an oligopoly. Oligopolies can produce identical or differentiated products. That doesn't really matter because of the fact there are very high barriers to entry. And so much like monopolies, much like monopolistic competition, oligopolies are also price makers, meaning that they can set their own price, and that the oligopoly is both the firm and the market in and of itself. And then we went over what mutual interdependence was or is with our last video on game theory. And so how do firms become oligopolies? Well, oligopolies only occur when there are a few large firms that start to control an industry, right? So think of like the cell phone market or the oil or gas market, right? Those are oligopolies here. And so once these few firms start to control an industry, the high barriers to entry keep other firms from entering, which keeps control of the market under these several large firms here. And so types of barriers to entry, we went over this, right? But to reiterate this, economies of scale, right? That can be a barrier to entry. While there's only a couple firms, right, that are able to lower their costs the more they produce. So think like utility companies. High startup costs is just expensive just to enter into the market, so that dissuades firms from entering in the first place. And lastly, ownership of raw materials. That one or couple firms control all the raw materials you would need to enter into that market itself. And so when we're talking about oligopolies in the graphs, there are three different types of oligopolies. There's price leadership, colluding oligopolies, and also non-colluding oligopolies. And let's go over each one. So first is price leadership. So before we even get started, right, we first have to discuss the idea that collusion is illegal, that firms are not allowed to talk to each other to determine a set price, right? So LG, Samsung, Apple are not allowed to talk to each other to basically determine how much they're going to sell each one of their flagship cell phones, right? Sadeko, Hertz, Sheets, they're not allowed to collaborate and talk to each other to determine how much to sell their gas at. And so the firms, right, cannot set prices together. And so what firms are going to use in oligopolies to get around this idea that collusion is illegal, they're going to use the price leadership model. Right? Because it is not collusion if the firms just follow one particular firm. And so the general process of price leadership is that the dominant firm, right, the firm that has the most control over the market, is going to initiate a price change. And the other firms are just going to follow that price change that the dominant firm sets, right? So if the dominant firm says, I'm going to lower my price, all the other firms are going to follow the lead and also lower their price. If the dominant firm says, well, I'm going to raise my price, all the other firms are going to follow the leader and raise their price as well. So there can be breakdowns, right? There can be temporary price wars that occur if firms do not follow the price increases of the dominant firms, right? So if the dominant firm increases their price, there can be a price war if the other firms choose not to follow it and just keep their price the same in the efforts to get more customers or consumers to purchase their good. And so that's when each firm is going to try to undercut one another. So that leads us into colluding oligopolies. And so colluding oligopolies are often known as cartels, right? A group of producers that create an agreement to fix prices here. And so in a way, it's a little bit like price leadership, but in a sense that it's more illegal because these firms are going to collude. They're going to work together. And so how it works is step one, the cartels or these colluding oligopolies set their prices and output at agreed upon levels. To do this, the firms in these colluding oligopolies need to have identical or highly similar demand and costs and also products here, right? Because if they have dissimilar products, well, there is no incentive for them to work together because their products are differentiated. So their products need to be similar. The most important part, though, is point number 3. Cartels have to have a way to punish the traders. Because if there's no way to punish the traders, then these colluding firms are going to just cheat, right? They're going to undercut one another. So there has to be a way to punish those who don't follow the agreed set upon levels of price and quantity. And so together, cartels or colluding oligopolies, they act as a monopoly itself. And so that's why our graph for oligopolies, there is no graph for price leadership, but there is a graph for colluding oligopolies, and this is the graph here. So whenever we talk about a graph for an oligopoly, we are referring to the graph for a colluding oligopoly here. And that's why I said at the very first video, the graph for a monopoly, the graph for a monopolistically competitive market structure, and also the graph for oligopolies are all one in the same. The only way that our oligopoly graph can look different than a monopoly or monopolistic competitive graph is with non-colluding oligopolies. And so with non-colluding oligopolies, you get something called the kinked demand curve model, which just shows how non-collusive or non-colluding oligopolies are interdependent. And so here, if the firms are not colluding, there are only 2 possible ways that these firms can react. There's only 2 possible options here. 1, they can match the price. So if the firm A increases or decreases their price, the other firms in the oligopoly market can match the price, right? They can either increase their price as well or decrease their price to match firm A's decision. Or they can just ignore it. If firm A increases their price, firm B and firm C and firm D can just ignore the price and keep their price lower than firm A's here. And so what this graph looks like is this, right? If this firm decides to increase their price, right? So in other words, they go from the equilibrium price of PE and they go to P1, right? Their price increased. What are other firms going to do? Well, other firms are just going to ignore their price and keep their prices the same. Why? Well, because if the products that are being produced are identical and firm A decides to raise their price, the other firms in the market have a really big incentive to keep their prices the same. Because then they will get more consumers here. And so if you notice here, as the only firm with high prices, the quantity demanded is going to decrease a lot, meaning, right, that in this portion, the demand curve is going to be extremely elastic. Remember, elastic just means if there's a change in price, the quantity demand is going to change a whole lot. And if you notice, right, our quantity did change a significant amount. Well, the other option that the firm has is, well, if firm A decides to decrease its price, right? So we went from equilibrium price to price 2, so our price decreased. Other firms then have an incentive to match and lower their prices. Because if they don't, then this original firm that did lower their price is going to get all the consumers. And so since all the firms have lower prices, the quantity demanded is going to increase, but just a tiny bit, right? So if you notice, quantity did increase, but not to the extent, right, that quantity decreased when the original firm increased its price there. So here, if the firm decreases its price, the demand curve is extremely inelastic, right? The quantity demanded is going to change, but it's not going to change a tremendous amount here. So with non-colluding oligopolies, this is what I mean by the kinked demand curve. You see our demand, right, go here, and then all of a sudden it's a different slope. And so this point right here represents the kink, that our demand curve goes from being elastic to inelastic there. And so our marginal revenue has a vertical gap, right? So right here, so at the kink, right, there's this vertical gap. The reason why there's a vertical gap is that the marginal cost can move, it can increase or decrease, and the equilibrium quantity won't necessarily change because price is sticky at the kink. So at this exact point, right, or at the kink, our price is what we're going to be calling sticky. There is no incentive to increase or decrease. It's going to remain the same. And that's the reason why we have this kink in our, or this gap in our marginal revenue curve. And so what I will say about this particular graph, about our kink demand curve model with non-colluding oligopolies, is it probably is not going to show up in the AP exam. The reason why we're going over this is because A, this is the third type of oligopoly, a non-colluding oligopoly, and B, just in case if it does show up, I wanted to sort of expose you guys to this graph here. But by far and large, whenever you think of an oligopoly graph, you think of that colluding oligopoly graph, which is the same graph for a monopoly and the same graph for a monopolistically competitive firm and market. All right, so this kink demand curve model graph is pretty much not going to show up. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.